In March 1943, the Allied High Command in the Pacific formally approved the strategy of selective neutralization of Japanese positions, avoiding costly frontal assaults. The Operation Cartwheel and subsequent campaigns in the Gilbert, Marshall, and Mariana Islands demonstrated that enemy garrisons could be rendered irrelevant through control of sea and air routes. Meanwhile, in Tokyo and the Empire's forward posts, few officers initially understood what it meant to be isolated in an ocean controlled by the enemy. Laughter echoed through the operations room when the telegrapher read the report. The Americans were hopping islands. Admiral Hiroyuki Takeda adjusted the ceremonial sword at his waist and allowed himself a smile. Strategic cowardice, he thought. Avoiding combat was admitting weakness. At that moment, no officer present at the Rabaul base could imagine that this laughter would be the last show of confidence they would have. 3 months later, the silence of the radios would speak more than any battle report ever had. This is the story of Japanese commanders mocked island hopping until their garrisons were cut off, a chronicle of how strategic arrogance met its downfall in the form of nautical maps and supply tables. The Pacific would not forgive those who underestimated the mathematics of modern warfare. Hiroyuki Takeda was born into a samurai family and believed that war was decided by will, not by tons of fuel. When the reports arrived describing American movements bypassing entire islands, he saw only confirmation of his superiority. The Westerners didn't have the stomach to fight, he thought, as he studied the map dotted with red pins marking Imperial positions. Rabaul, his current base, was considered impregnable. Fortifications in volcanic rock, coastal artillery positioned at perfect angles, and an airstrip capable of launching 200 planes daily. The scent of freshly burnt gunpowder still lingered in the air when he called his officers together to review the strategic situation. Takeda believed that every defended island was a clenched fist in the enemy's face, and abandoning them would be treason against the emperor. The officers gathered shared the same certainty, though some of the younger ones showed hesitation as they analyzed the numbers of Allied ships sighted. Colonel Masao Fujinami, recently transferred to a garrison in the Solomon Islands, was one of the few who raised a technical question. How could supply routes be guaranteed if the defensive perimeter was breached at multiple points simultaneously? The question was met with silent disapproval. Takeda responded that the Imperial Navy would never allow such a scenario, that the convoys would continue flowing as they always had, and doubting that was to doubt Japan itself. Fujinami lowered his eyes to the map, noticing how the distances between islands seemed larger when drawn on paper than when described in patriotic speeches. The paper of the map was thin, almost translucent under the light of the lamps, and he could feel its fragile texture under his fingers as he traced imaginary evacuation routes he would never dare mention aloud. On the other side of the Pacific in Pearl Harbor, Commander Samuel Whitaker studied the same maps with a radically different mindset. To him, each Japanese island was not a target to be captured, but a variable in a resource equation. Whitaker coordinated air and amphibious operations with the precision of an accountant auditing financial balances, calculating how many men, how much fuel, and how much time would be required for each objective. His team worked in continuous shifts, cross-checking reconnaissance photos with intelligence reports coming from submarines and radio interceptions. The smell of diesel oil and strong coffee permeated the operations room, a combination that had become the signature scent of the Allied war machine. Whitaker didn't see enemies. He saw logistical problems that needed to be neutralized as efficiently as possible, preferably without wasting American lives in unnecessary frontal assaults. Lieutenant Grace Montgomery worked 3 floors below, in a windowless room, where the only constant sound was the clicking of typewriters and the buzzing of radio equipment. She and her team of cryptanalysts worked 16-hour days deciphering Japanese communications, a tedious job that occasionally produced nuggets of strategic gold. Recently, they had identified patterns in supply requests coming from isolated garrisons: medicine, ammunition, canned food. The numbers revealed not just what they needed, but how desperate they were. Montgomery noticed that some posts had already requested emergency rations 3 times consecutively, a clear sign that the convoys were not arriving. She compiled this data into reports that went up to Whitaker, and from there to the higher-ups, who decided which islands to attack and which to simply observe as they died from logistical starvation. The war was being won in rooms like that, where the deadliest weapon was the understanding of enemy supply chains. Chief Petty Officer Elias Carter didn't deal with codes or high-level strategy, but with the raw reality of building military infrastructure on hostile beaches. He commanded naval construction teams that landed on newly captured islands and, in a matter of weeks, transformed coral reefs into functional airstrips. Carter oversaw the unloading of tons of heavy equipment, leveling uneven terrain, and paving makeshift runways with perforated steel plates that allowed heavy bombers to take off. His work was a testament to American industrial power, the ability to design not just military strength, but complete infrastructure over thousands of miles of open ocean. While Japanese officers believed that will and courage would define the war, Carter embodied the opposite truth. Whoever controlled the tools and materials would control the Pacific. And at that moment, with each new runway built, the logistical siege on the Japanese Empire tightened another degree, silent and inexorable like the rising tide. Masao Fujinami landed at his new position, an island whose name he could hardly pronounce, under a sky set ablaze by the sunset. The garrison consisted of 800 men, 3 medium-caliber coastal guns, and supplies that, according to the official manifest, would last 4 months. Fujinami was too realistic to trust manifests and immediately ordered a full inventory. What he discovered was less reassuring. 2 weeks of full rations, followed by 2 months of reduced rations if no convoy arrived. He asked the departing officer when the last supply delivery had been made. The answer came with an evasive look. 6 weeks ago. For the first time, Fujinami felt the weight of isolation, not as an abstract concept, but as a physical reality that could be counted in cans of food and boxes of ammunition. The smell of mildew already permeated the subterranean storerooms dug into the volcanic rock, a sign that the tropical humidity was corroding even the metal of the cans. The first weeks passed in a tense but predictable routine: artillery drills, coastal patrols, equipment maintenance. Fujinami established strict observation shifts and kept the men busy with tasks that would prevent them from overthinking the broader strategic situation. But reality imposed itself through details that were impossible to ignore. No Japanese plane had flown over the island for 12 days, and the scheduled radio transmissions with regional command were starting to fail. First it was 1 lost transmission, then 2 in a row, until radio silence became more common than received messages. The operators obsessively checked the equipment, swapped out tubes, adjusted frequencies. But the problem wasn't in the machines. It was that on the other side, there might be no one transmitting anymore. Fujinami ordered regular contact attempts to continue, but forbade public discussions of the communication failures, fearing that panic would spread faster than any tropical disease. Meanwhile, 200 kilometers away, Commander Whitaker was studying reconnaissance photographs of the same island. The images showed well-camouflaged artillery positions, skillfully constructed defensive trenches, and a garrison that, according to intelligence estimates, was at full operational capacity. Whitaker marked the island with a yellow circle on his map. Not red for high priority, not green for neutralized, but yellow for continuous observation. The decision had already been made at higher levels. That position didn't warrant an amphibious assault. It would be isolated, occasionally bombed to prevent use of the makeshift airstrip, and left to rot. 2 American submarines patrolled the approach routes, and any Japanese attempt to resupply the garrison would be intercepted before it reached halfway. Whitaker drafted operational orders specifying weekly reconnaissance flights and monthly bombing runs, just enough to keep the defenders on the defensive without wasting precious resources. It was war by accountant, not by general, and it was working perfectly. Grace Montgomery identified Fujinami's island in her analyses when she intercepted a desperate transmission requesting confirmation of supply routes. The message had been sent 3 times consecutively, a clear sign that no response was coming. She cross-referenced this information with data on Japanese naval movements and concluded that no convoy had been dispatched to that sector in 2 months. Montgomery compiled a report indicating that the garrison was likely operating on critical reserves, and that within 60 to 90 days, it would face operational collapse from starvation, even without direct military intervention. The report went up to Whitaker, who attached it to the intelligence files with a note. Confirms current strategy. Continue observation. The bureaucratic efficiency of that process was terrifying in its coldness. Men being condemned to a slow death through typewritten memorandums and stamped triplicates. Montgomery sometimes wondered if the Japanese officers understood they were being defeated not by battles, but by logistics spreadsheets carefully maintained in climate-controlled offices thousands of miles from any combat front. Meanwhile, Elias Carter was overseeing the construction of another forward airstrip, this time on an atoll captured 3 weeks earlier. His teams worked under the scorching sun, operating bulldozers and rollers that had been unloaded directly from specialized cargo ships. In 10 days, they turned a deserted beach into a functional airfield, complete with underground fuel depots, makeshift control towers, and anti-aircraft positions. From the new airstrip, B-24 Liberator bombers could reach targets that had previously been out of range, including the island where Fujinami was watching the empty sky, wondering when the next convoy would arrive. Carter knew nothing about Fujinami, nor Fujinami about Carter, but their destinies were connected by the unrelenting logic of modern industrial warfare. One was building the means of isolation, while the other suffered its consequences. The war was being decided not by courage or discipline, but by the ability to move tons of concrete, steel, and fuel across entire oceans, and then keep those supply lines running indefinitely. Admiral Takeda received the first alarming report on a cloudy morning, when the tropical humidity made the air almost solid inside the operations room. 3 garrisons had failed to respond to regular check-in transmissions, and aerial reconnaissance indicated the presence of American ships freely crossing routes that, theoretically, should have been under Japanese control. He ordered long-range patrols to investigate, but only 2 of the 5 assigned planes returned, and the pilots reported skies filled with enemy fighters operating from bases that shouldn't have existed. Takeda spread recent aerial photographs across the table, and, with growing disbelief, realized that the Americans had built full airfields on islands that had recently been little more than sandbanks. The speed of that construction defied everything he knew about military logistics. How was it possible to erect infrastructure so quickly in such hostile environments? The texture of the photographs was grainy, but clear enough to show paved runways, mounted hangars, and organized rows of aircraft. Takeda felt something he would never publicly admit: fear. Staff meetings grew progressively more tense as reality impinged on doctrine. Officers who had once spoken confidently about counteroffensives now discussed in low tones about consolidating defensive perimeters and prioritizing strategically viable positions. The term viable began to appear more and more often, a euphemism for admitting that many garrisons were being abandoned to their own devices. Takeda resisted this logic as much as he could, insisting that every imperial position should be defended to the last man, but the numbers were relentless. The Imperial Navy had lost so many transport ships that it could no longer maintain all supply routes simultaneously. Choices had to be made, and those choices meant condemning thousands of loyal men to isolation and eventual destruction. The smell of burnt paper began to permeate the command complex, as documents considered too sensitive were destroyed preemptively, a tacit preparation for an eventual evacuation that no one dared to explicitly mention. On Fujinami's island, rationing began in the 6th week. He reduced daily portions by 30%, justifying the measure as a temporary precaution until the next convoy arrived. But internally, Fujinami knew no convoy would come. The radio transmissions had completely ceased, and attempts to establish contact resulted only in empty static. He watched his men gradually lose weight, their uniforms growing progressively looser on bodies that were beginning to consume their own fat reserves. Tropical diseases became more frequent: malaria, dysentery, skin infections that, under normal circumstances, would have been easily treated, but now threatened to become fatal due to the lack of proper medicines. Fujinami kept a private diary where he recorded casualties, not from combat, but from malnutrition and disease, numbers that climbed inexorably as the defensive perimeter remained untouched. The war was killing his men without even the dignity of direct confrontation, and he could do absolutely nothing to prevent it. Commander Whitaker reviewed progress reports with professional satisfaction, though devoid of emotion. The selective neutralization strategy was working better than expected. Isolated Japanese garrisons consumed their own resources as they became progressively irrelevant to the overall war effort. Every new airstrip built by teams like Carter's expanded the Allied operating radius, allowing bombers and fighters to patrol ever larger areas. American submarines reported the regular sinking of small Japanese transport ships that desperately tried to resupply isolated positions but were intercepted before completing their missions. Whitaker noted that the success rate of enemy convoys had dropped from 60% to less than 20% in just 4 months. That wasn't just a military victory, it was systematic logistical strangulation, precise as a surgeon's scalpel cutting supply arteries one by one. He signed orders to intensify submarine patrols on specific routes, knowing that every enemy ship sunk meant another garrison that would never receive reinforcements. Grace Montgomery began noticing different patterns in the intercepts, messages becoming shorter and shorter, sometimes just emergency codes repeated without additional context. Some transmissions included words not found in standard code manuals, desperate improvisations by operators trying to communicate situations for which there were no established protocols. She identified terms like critical supply, casualties from disease, and in one particularly disturbing case, requesting permission for final action. Montgomery understood the implied meaning of that last phrase. Officers requesting permission for ritual suicide if the situation became untenable. She included these observations in her reports, but with clinical and detached notes, because allowing herself to feel the human weight of those words would make it impossible to continue the work. The intelligence war demanded absolute emotional coldness, even when the data revealed 3 months after assuming command. Masao Fujinami had accounted for 143 dead, none of them from direct enemy action. Malaria, dysentery, beriberi, and simple starvation had decimated almost 20% of his force. The remaining men maintained external discipline, but Fujinami saw the despair in their sunken eyes, the slowness of their movements, the silence that had replaced the usual chatter. He himself had lost 12 kilograms, and his hands trembled slightly as he held the binoculars during the night watches. The island had become a perfectly effective prison, surrounded not by bars, but by thousands of kilometers of ocean controlled by the enemy. American ships occasionally crossed the horizon, so distant that they appeared only as gray smudges, but close enough to make it clear that any attempt at escape would be intercepted before reaching the shore. Fujinami sometimes wondered if it would have been more honorable to have died in open battle than to wither away slowly in that calculated strategic oblivion. The last air raid occurred on a cloudless afternoon, when 6 B-24 bombers flew over the island in perfect formation and dropped their payloads on the artillery positions. The bombs destroyed one of the 3 guns and damaged supply depots that were already nearly empty. The attack lasted less than 10 minutes, and the planes disappeared over the horizon before any effective response could be made. Fujinami understood the implicit message. The enemy could destroy them completely at any time, but chose not to. Keeping them alive but powerless was more strategically advantageous than wasting resources on a full assault. That realization was more humiliating than any defeat on the battlefield. They were not a threat enough to justify complete destruction, merely a minor irritation deserving of occasional attention. The smell of burnt explosives lingered in the air for hours after the attack, a bitter reminder that they were completely at the mercy of an enemy who did not even consider them a priority. Admiral Takeda, confronted with similar reports from dozens of isolated garrisons, finally accepted what he had resisted admitting. The American strategy was not cowardice, but brutal brilliance. By avoiding costly frontal assaults and focusing on controlling sea and air routes, the Allies had transformed the Pacific into a giant game board where Japanese positions became progressively irrelevant. Takeda studied updated maps and saw with painful clarity how the Imperial defensive perimeter had shrunk, not through lost battles, but through systematic isolation. Islands that had once been forward bases were now just red dots on maps, garrisons that continued to exist, only because they had not yet completely died. He drafted orders to concentrate resources on the positions still viable, but he knew it was too late. The Allied logistical machine operated on a scale that defied Japanese response. For every ship lost, the Americans put 3 new ones to sea. For every runway destroyed, they built 2 replacements. Industrial war was proving decisive, and Japan was on the wrong side of the industrial equation. Commander Whitaker received a meritorious service medal for operational excellence, recognition that his meticulous coordination of selective neutralization operations had significantly accelerated the collapse of Japan's ability to resist organized. He accepted the award with formal courtesy, but without particular enthusiasm. To Whitaker, it was simply well-executed work, competent application of logistical principles to military problems. During the brief ceremony, he thought of the reconnaissance photographs that crossed his desk daily, showing islands where men died slowly, while waiting for reinforcements that would never arrive. Whitaker felt neither guilt nor particular satisfaction with that fate. He felt only the confirmation that modern warfare was fundamentally different from any previous conflict, no longer a clash of wills, but the management of complex systems of supply, transport, and communication. Whoever mastered these systems would dominate the oceans and, eventually, the world. Grace Montgomery was promoted and transferred to a new post working directly with planners for future operations. Her analysis of enemy communication patterns had proven invaluable, revealing not only Japanese intentions, but their growing inability to execute those intentions due to lack of material means. In her last week in the old role, she organized her files and came across piles of intercepted transcriptions, desperate supply requests, reports of increasing casualties, pleas for instructions that never received responses. Montgomery closed the last file and locked it in the safe, a mechanical gesture that allowed her to separate the human content of those messages from the professional necessity of treating them as mere data. Before leaving, she looked one last time at the windowless room where she had spent so much time deciphering enemy secrets, and allowed herself a brief moment of reflection on the fact that she was helping win a war by killing men through spreadsheets and reports. A weapon as lethal as any bomb, but infinitely more impersonal. 6 months after the onset of isolation, Fujinami's garrison had transformed into a collective of wandering specters. 420 men remained alive, but alive had become a technically correct, yet existentially questionable term. They moved with the slowness of sleepwalkers, performing military routines by pure conditioned reflex, while their bodies consumed muscle and internal organs in a desperate attempt to maintain basic vital functions. Fujinami had ordered that the defensive positions be kept operational, knowing it was a futile but necessary exercise to preserve some shred of purpose. Without purpose, without a visible enemy to fight, the men would simply give up, and the collapse would be complete. The smell of death now permeated the island, not the sudden death of battle, but the slow deterioration of bodies that decayed while still breathing. Fujinami kept the diary updated, recording each casualty with handwriting that became progressively more tremulous as his own strength faltered. One morning, one of the sentries spotted smoke on the horizon, and the alarm was given with pathetic enthusiasm. Fujinami grabbed the binoculars with hands that could barely hold the weight of the equipment and focused on the distant column of black smoke. For a moment, he allowed himself irrational hope. Perhaps the convoy was finally arriving. Perhaps the command had not abandoned them completely. But as the vessel approached, its silhouette became unmistakable. An American destroyer cruising calmly through Japanese territorial waters as if they were private property. The ship didn't even change course as it passed the island, simply continuing its regular patrol with absolute indifference. Fujinami lowered the binoculars and dismissed the men who had rushed to the artillery positions. There wasn't enough ammunition to waste on targets that were out of effective range, and even if there had been, a single damaged gun posed no threat to a modern warship. They were irrelevant, and the enemy didn't even bother to pretend otherwise. Admiral Takeda was summoned to Tokyo for an emergency meeting of the Naval High Command. The trip was a logistical nightmare. There were no more safe direct flights, and he had to travel by circular routes using small boats that sailed only at night to avoid Allied air patrols. When he finally arrived in the capital, he found an atmosphere of collective denial that bordered on surrealism. Senior officers discussed grand counteroffensives, while maps on the wall clearly showed that the Imperial defensive perimeter had shrunk to a fraction of its original size. Takeda presented a detailed report on the real situation: isolated garrisons, collapsed supply lines, the impossibility of maintaining external positions without maritime control. His words were met with uncomfortable silence, followed by discussions that completely ignored the points he raised. It was at that moment that Takeda understood the final truth. The High Command had no solution, only bureaucratic rituals that maintained the illusion of control while reality disintegrated around them. The air conditioning in the meeting room buzzed monotonously, an artificial sound that grotesquely contrasted with the knowledge that thousands of men were dying slowly on forgotten islands while officers in spotless uniforms debated fantastical strategies. Commander Whitaker expanded his operations to include not only neutralization, but psychological monitoring of isolated garrisons. Grace Montgomery and her successor developed behavioral profiles based on enemy radio transmission patterns, frequency of contact attempts, tone of intercepted messages, even analysis of coding errors that revealed the deteriorating mental state of the operators. These profiles allowed planners to predict when specific garrisons would reach total collapse, valuable information for deciding whether a position still posed a residual threat or could be completely ignored. Whitaker studied these reports with academic interest, fascinated by the precision with which human despair could be quantified and categorized. In one report, he read an analysis about an island identified only by coordinates, Fujinami's Island, indicating that the garrison had entered the terminal stage of isolation and no longer represented measurable operational capacity. Whitaker struck that position from his list of active targets and filed the dossier away. It was maximum efficiency, killing enemies without wasting a single bullet, using only time and distance as weapons. Elias Carter and his naval construction teams became legendary within the Allied military structure. They had developed rapid construction techniques that allowed them to build functional airfields in a matter of days, using prefabricated materials and heavy equipment that was unloaded directly from specialized ships. Carter personally supervised the construction of 17 forward airstrips in 18 months, each one expanding the Allied reach and tightening the logistical siege on the Japanese Empire. He didn't think in abstract strategic terms. He thought in tons of concrete, cubic meters of compacted coral, and liters of aviation fuel stored in underground tanks. But every concrete number translated into strategic reality. More bombers in the air meant fewer Japanese ships reaching their destination. Fewer ships meant fewer supplies. Fewer supplies meant more garrisons withering in forced isolation. Carter was a crucial cog in the machine that was crushing Japan, and he performed his role with the professional pride of a competent worker who knew exactly his part in the final victory. The smell of diesel and fresh concrete had become the scent of inevitable victory. Fujinami made his last entry in the diary with almost illegible handwriting, his hand trembling so much that the words seemed to crawl across the page like dying insects. He recorded 287 dead, 133 survivors in critical condition, and no prospects of rescue or resupply. Military discipline had collapsed 3 weeks earlier, when a mutiny attempt had been suppressed, only because the mutineers were physically incapable of taking any effective action. Now the men simply waited, lying in their positions as life gradually drained away. Some had died in their sleep, a transition so smooth that comrades took hours to realize they weren't just resting. Fujinami wrote that he would maintain protocol until the end, that he would not betray his oath to the emperor, even if the emperor had completely forgotten them. But deep down, in a corner of his mind that he barely dared examine, he knew that continuing to live there was less loyalty and more an inability to do anything else. The texture of the diary paper was damp with tropical humidity, perhaps from tears he no longer had the strength to shed. An American reconnaissance seaplane flew low over the island, photographing the defensive positions without encountering any reaction. The pilot reported total absence of movement, no artillery fire, no sign of organized military activity. The photographs revealed intact but abandoned structures, empty trenches, guns pointing to the sky but with no visible crews. The report was filed with a note: position neutralized by isolation. No further action required. That island, which 6 months earlier had been considered a significant fortified base, was now just an irrelevant point on a map increasingly dominated by Allied markings. The seaplane moved on to the next reconnaissance target, and the pilot had already forgotten about that specific island before landing back at base. This is how entire garrisons disappeared from the war, not in dramatic explosions or epic battles, but in typewritten and filed administrative reports, bureaucratized death so completely that they lost any recognizable human meaning. Takeda returned to Rabaul, only to discover that partial evacuation orders had been issued during his absence. The base he commanded, once considered an impregnable fortress, would be reduced to a minimal garrison as resources were concentrated on positions closer to the Japanese mainland. He protested formally, argued that abandoning Rabaul meant losing any ability to project power in the South Pacific, but his arguments were met with the tired patience of superiors who had already made irreversible decisions. Takeda then understood that he was no longer commanding an operational base, but managing a slow and orderly retreat, trying to preserve institutional dignity while the empire collapsed around him. He walked through the base corridors, feeling the weight of every wrong decision, every underestimation of the enemy, every moment of arrogance that had contributed to this disaster. The smell of burning documents returned, more intense now. A preparation for evacuation that everyone knew was irreversible. Takeda had laughed when he first heard of the island-hopping strategy, and now that laugh echoed in his memory as mockery of his own catastrophic strategic failure. Grace Montgomery, in her new post, began working on post-conflict analyses, studying how Japan's logistical collapse could inform future strategies. She revisited years of intercepts and identified a clear pattern. Japan had lost the war the moment it lost the ability to maintain supply lines, and this had happened long before decisive battles were fought. The isolated garrisons were a symptom, not the cause. The fundamental problem was Japan's industrial inability to compete with Allied production capacity. Montgomery compiled these insights into a classified report that would circulate for decades in military planning circles. The definitive study on how modern warfare depended more on factories and cargo ships than on soldiers and armaments. She included a specific section on the psychological aspects of prolonged isolation, based on analyses of intercepted transmissions from collapsing garrisons. It was exceptional academic work, but sometimes late at night, Montgomery wondered if she should feel something beyond intellectual interest in the human suffering that her data represented. The answer never came, and eventually she stopped asking. Commander Whitaker was promoted to captain and assigned to lead planning operations in the Central Pacific Theater. His success in coordinating selective neutralizations had become a model for future campaigns, not just against Japan, but as a general doctrine applicable to any conflict where logistical control was viable. Whitaker gave lectures at military academies, explaining with mathematical precision how to turn geography into a weapon, how to use time and distance to kill more efficiently than explosives. Younger officers took frantic notes, absorbing lessons that would redefine naval warfare for future generations. During one of these lectures, someone asked about the fate of the isolated garrisons, whether there were records of what happened to those men. Whitaker responded that some were eventually captured when the war ended. Others simply disappeared, presumably wiped out by starvation and disease. He said this in the neutral tone of a professor discussing historical data, and the audience accepted it with the same neutrality. No one mentioned that those data represented thousands of slow and agonizing deaths that could have been avoided with quick and merciful assaults, but were deliberately prolonged because it was strategically more efficient to let them die alone. The war ended in August 1945, but it took additional months for search teams to locate and document all the isolated garrisons. Fujinami was found dead at his command post, his body mummified by the tropical heat, the diary beside him with the last entry dated 7 months earlier. Of the 800 people originally under his command, 147 survivors were rescued, walking specters who could barely comprehend that the war had ended. They were repatriated, treated in military hospitals, and eventually returned to a Japanese society that preferred not to hear stories about how they had been forgotten while fighting loyally until complete physical collapse. Fujinami was posthumously awarded a commendation for exemplary devotion to duty, an honor that his widow accepted in a brief ceremony where no one mentioned the real circumstances of his death. His diary was filed away in a military storage facility, a document too disturbing for public analysis, a testimony that honor and loyalty sometimes meant simply dying slowly in a forgotten place, while distant commanders made decisions based on efficiency tables. Admiral Takeda survived the war and faced war crimes tribunals, not for atrocities, but for strategic incompetence that had cost tens of thousands of lives. He testified about decisions made and not made, about orders issued when it was already too late, about meetings where reality was ignored in favor of doctrinal fantasies. Takeda admitted that he had deeply underestimated American industrial capacity and the effectiveness of unconventional strategies. When specifically asked about his initial reaction to the island-hopping strategy, he confirmed that he had laughed, that he had considered cowardice what was actually brutal strategic brilliance. The transcript of his testimony became required reading at military academies worldwide, the perfect example of how cultural arrogance and doctrinal rigidity can blind commanders to operational realities. Takeda was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but was released after 4 for health reasons. He spent the remaining years writing memoirs that no one wanted to publish, dying obscure and largely forgotten, a shadow of the confident officer who once commanded an impregnable fortress. Grace Montgomery left the military in 1946 and returned to civilian life, but found it impossible to disengage from the analytical mindset developed over years of deciphering enemy communications. She briefly worked in the private sector, then taught mathematics at a small university, but never mentioned her wartime work. Only once, decades later, during a dinner with academic colleagues, someone casually mentioned Pearl Harbor, and Montgomery commented that the war wasn't won in naval battles, but in windowless rooms where people translated enemy despair into typewritten reports. The comment was met with uncomfortable silence, and she never mentioned the subject again. In her later years, Montgomery would occasionally wake in the night thinking of the intercepted messages, the voices distorted by codes and radio frequencies begging for help she knew would never come. She had helped win the war by exterminating enemies through information, a method as effective as any physical weapon, but leaving invisible scars unlike those of conventional combat wounds. Commander, then Captain, then Admiral, Samuel Whitaker became a legendary figure in naval strategic planning circles. His logistics neutralization methodologies were codified into official doctrine, studied and replicated in subsequent conflicts. Whitaker retired with full honors, received countless decorations, and wrote the definitive book on amphibious operations in the Pacific, which became standard text at military academies. The book devoted 2 chapters to the selective isolation strategy, explaining with mathematical clarity how the cost-benefit of avoiding frontal assaults justified morally leaving enemy garrisons to wither. He argued that saving Allied lives through logistical methods was an ethical imperative, superior to minimizing enemy suffering, a position few dared publicly contest. Whitaker died respected and celebrated, never publicly showing any questioning of the strategic choices that condemned thousands to particularly cruel deaths. If there were private doubts, he took them to the grave, maintaining until the end the conviction that operational efficiency was the highest virtue in a military context. Chief Petty Officer Elias Carter returned home and used his naval construction experience to found a civil engineering company that thrived in the post-war economic boom. He rarely spoke of his military service, preferring to focus on the present and future, but he kept in his office a framed photograph showing him beside an excavator on some tropical beach, and occasionally clients asked about the picture. Carter would briefly explain that he had built airfields during the war, that it was hard work but important, and then change the subject. What he never mentioned was that those airfields were as lethal as the bombers that took off from them, that every paved runway represented more isolated islands, more garrisons without supplies, more men dying slowly while waiting for impossible rescue. Carter probably didn't think in those terms. For him, construction was construction, a technical problem solved with professional competence. But objectively, he had been the architect of the siege that strangled an entire empire, and his civil construction machines had killed with an efficiency no cannon could ever match. Years later, when his grandchildren asked what he had done in the war, Carter simply answered, "I built things." It was a technical truth that omitted a deeper meaning, like many truths about that conflict. We won not because we were braver, but because we were more patient. We let geography and time fight for us, and they proved to be more reliable allies than any army. Unattributed excerpt from a classified report of the Allied Pacific High Command, 1945.